Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Module 2, so welcome to the program. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. Could you just type in, please, on the question box over on the right-hand side, just the word clear? That lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Could I ask you to do that? That'll make it. Right, thanks, Joan. Thanks, John. Thank you, Fred. Okay, so obviously I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. So welcome to the program. This is the second in the series, of course, and we're looking at the influencing capability profile today. Now, you got a chance to complete that, I hope, before this debrief, which is essentially what it is. So what I'm going to do is debrief you on the profile. But if you haven't completed the profile, that's okay, because you'll get an opportunity to complete that at the conclusion of this program. So that's part of the package of the Lunch and Learn, is the influencing capabilities profile that can be done online. So let me know if you haven't got around to completing it and you'd like to, and I'll certainly send you the link, and you can complete it in your own time after this. All right, so in Unit 1, I asked you to look at giving some positive feedback. That was the homework, and in fact, what I wanted you to do is to give 3 bits of positive feedback a day, and I wonder how you've gone with that. So if you've got any comment or observations about that, I'd be happy to hear those. But essentially, feedback was a critically important component of the program, and today, of course, we're going to move on to enhancing your influencing style or capability. So we'll look at that today. All right, so there's basically 4 things that I'm covering during this process. The first thing that I'm going to look at is what influencing is. I think when we mention the word influence, people often have very strange views about it. They might consider it, for example, to be manipulation or being cunning or underhanded. In fact, it's nothing of the sort, or certainly not in my mind anyway. Certainly it can be, but not in this case. So we'll define what we mean by influence. One of the reasons I put together the profile, incidentally, which comes out of my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, which I wrote in 2015. One of the reasons I wrote that is that when I went out to find some information on influence, at one end of the scale, we had some very academic type material, and at the other end of the scale, very salesy type material, and both of those weren't really relevant to the job of managing. So I thought we'll put together something that's applicable for influence for leaders in management roles. So that's essentially what I did. So the second point I'm going to cover today is the influencing capabilities framework. So what does the framework look like? If you completed the profile, you'd be probably familiar with it already because it would have been as part of your report. But nevertheless, I'll run through it thoroughly with you and explain how it works and what it means for you as a leader. Then we'll look at the 4 influencing strategies. Now, in your report, up on the top right-hand corner, if you click on the icon there for each, you'll get a little video clip of 4 famous leaders, and you can actually look at them and how they like to influence, and you'll see it in their presentations. And then what I'm going to do is finish up with 4, quite a few influencing tools that you can use to improve or enhance your influencing capability in the area, perhaps where you got the least score. Now, in my book, I cover 65 influencing capabilities or strategies or tools. Obviously, I can't go through that in today's session. So what I've done is I've picked some key ones out and I'll share them with you. All right, so that's what we're covering over the next hour. So I want you to have a look. Hopefully this will come up on your screen shortly. And I want you to have a look at these 4 historical figures. I can say to you that one's still alive and the other 3 have passed away. But I'm going to ask you a question. What do they all have in common? what do you think all these leaders have in common? Now, just in the question box there, I'd like you to type in, what do you think these 4 leaders have in common? Could I just get some responses from people? What do they all have in common? Okay, one person says they're all leaders. That's correct. Another person says they're all highly influential. That's correct as well. And they're all famous characters. Yep, that's another response as well. All of those are true. And in fact, why I've selected these 4, and I've spoken about them at length in my book, is that these are all 4 of these characters have been highly influential in their lifetime, and they've made a significant mark. Now, I haven't selected them because they happen to be heroes of mine. I've selected them because of their capacity to influence. They're all respected. That's another response. Thanks, Leslie. That's true. They are all respected in their own way. I should also say they're highly controversial as well. You can find some negative information about any of these 4 people if you choose to look on Google. But if I go around the list and explain who we're talking about, up the top, going clockwise, we've got Al Gore, who was the former Vice President of the United States, who you might recall in 2000 was up against George W. Bush in that very famous election, which actually ended up being sorted out in the courts because of the controversy in the state of Florida. And so, in fact, Gore lost that election and went on to reinvent himself as a climate change expert. The second person there going clockwise is Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was a civil rights activist in the United States, principally in the 1960s. And in 1965, he wrote one of the great speeches of all time, which was, "I Have a Dream." And in 1968, he was tragically assassinated, and along with Bobby Kennedy during that year. But nevertheless, he did bring to consciousness the need for America and the world indeed to do something about civil rights. And many would argue there's still a challenge to go in that space. The third person there is the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Great Britain for 10 years, and during her reign, she divided the nation. There were people who were very for her, and there were people who were very against her. In fact, when she died, there were people dancing in the streets celebrating. So intense was the feeling towards her by those that didn't like her. And then the fourth person there is Mother Teresa. So Mother Teresa was anointed a saint by the Catholic Church not too long ago for the work that she did for the homeless people, the poor people in the streets of Calcutta and other places in the world. And she did some tremendous work there, bringing and marshalling support towards the streets of these poverty-stricken areas of the world. So all four have been highly influential in their own way. Now, I've obviously tried to be politically correct here. I've got two females, two males. We've got right-wing, left-wing political views. And I've done that because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be criticised for selecting all white males or, all of one political persuasion. I didn't want people to be sort of distracted by that and forget about the message. So I'll refer to these four as we go through the presentation today. So let's move on. Now, this is my definition of influence, and I guess if you Google the word influence, you'll get many, many definitions. So I'm not suggesting this is the right definition. I'm just simply saying that this is my definition, and really it sets up the broadcast at this stage. So influence is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. Now, the key points there are power. So influence is a source of power. It's also not just about getting people to do things, but also getting people perhaps to change their point of view. but to do it in such a way that people are willing to change their point of view or willing to do something they weren't planning to do because it was done in a transparent or ethical way. So, in other words, it's not about manipulation. It's really about because people want to be influenced. You've been able to create the right environment for people to change. And that's essentially what this is about. So it's not about being cunning, underhanded, or manipulative. It's all about being transparent and getting people to change willingly. So I just want to make that point up front before we moved on any further. Now, the other point I want to make about influence is an important one because you're sitting in this broadcast today, and I'd have to say to you that you and everybody else is actually in the business of influence. So if you're a leader or a manager, you're in the business of influence. Your job is actually about influencing other people. And it's even more relevant today, 2018, than it was at any other time in history. And the reason for that is that hierarchy is breaking down, and people who have positions of authority, what we call legitimate power, that legitimate power, that is, making decisions based on a position, is no longer as valued as it once was. So our job is to try to influence people to do things in a way that they do, as I said, willingly and ethically, but they do it because they are influenced, not because of necessarily your hierarchical position. Now, there are three variables when you're influencing anybody, and I want to run through these and just have a think about these, and in particular, if you've got your influencing capabilities profile handy, you might like to consider it. The first important point is that you have a preferred style and approach. Now, how do we know what that is? Well, your influencing profile showed you what your preferred style or approach was. So where you had relatively high scores, that's what you naturally influence people using. It's probably likely also that you are influenced when people try and influence you that way as well, which is interesting. So if you enjoy facts and figures and logic, and that's the way people influence you using a rational approach, it's highly likely that that's how you'll try and influence other people as well. So your approach has obviously got something to do with it. But don't forget the other person or persons that is the people you're influencing also have a profile. Now they may not have completed the influencing capabilities profile, but nevertheless they have a predisposition to a way of being influenced. And obviously we've all had cases where we've tried to influence somebody and found that the glaze goes in their eyes and we're not getting anywhere. Now, one of the reasons for that, of course, is that we're using our approach, but our approach isn't gelling with the person that we're trying to influence. And of course, what we try and do is we try even harder to influence them using our style and approach. And of course, that doesn't work. We need to change our way of going about things. And the third variable in all this is, of course, the context. The situation that you're in will dictate the kind of influencing strategy you'll use. Now, we're not alert enough, none of us, to be able to sort of in the hurly-burly of work, to be able to go and make a judgment. One, what is my style and approach? Two, what's the other person's style and approach? And three, what the situation dictates in terms of what influencing strategy I should use. So my point about this is that if plan A isn't working, we need to try plan B or C or D. So in other words, we vary our approach depending on the impact or lack of impact we're having in the circumstances that we're in. And that's the key message that I want you to get out of this broadcast, that you've got to be flexible and malleable enough to change your approach and style depending on, one, the other person or group of people that you're influencing and the context that you're in, which means that you might have to influence using a style or approach that's foreign to you or certainly not as comfortable as your preferred style and approach. So it's about being flexible is essentially the key message out of today's broadcast. So what will come up on your screen shortly is the influencing capability framework that I developed. And I want to run through the framework with you and give you some indicators as to how the framework works, so that when we start talking about your profile, it'll become a little bit more, it'll be a little bit more digestible. So you'll notice that up the top of it's a typical 2x2 matrix, and you'll notice that up the top I've got two styles: push and pull. So let me just put up a little screen to show you what they might represent. So push, using a push style, is where you perhaps would use a driving, proposing, giving information approach. So it's pretty much a one-way approach where you're trying to influence people on the strength of an argument. Whereas the pull style, on the other hand, is more taking people with you. That's working with people in a more collaborative way and bouncing off their ideas, seeking out information and engaging with them to a point where they become influenced by the engagement with you rather than the strength of your argument. So the very first thing that you might like to look at on your profile is your push or your pull style stronger? And you'll get a score on one of your profile pages, which will show whether you are predisposed to a push or pull style. What you need to try and do is to use both. And really, if I walked up to anyone that was led by you and I said to them, do you think that your leader uses a push or a pull style? The perfect answer you would want would be, well, he or she uses both. Sometimes it's push, sometimes it's pull. It might depend on the circumstances, which is precisely what you'd want to hear. You don't necessarily want to hear, oh no, she's push or he's pull, because that means you've been typecast into a particular style. But the higher your score in either of these, the more likely it is that other people will recognize that style in your influencing and the way you go about your work. Now, the other variable is over here on the the left-hand side, which is the logical and emotional approach. And I've just put up a little chart there to show you what they might mean. So people who like to use logic will tend to use facts and evidence, and they'll be quite rational in their approach, usually reasonably structured in the way they go about things. And of course, some professions are predisposed to that, such as engineering or accounting or landscape gardening. These sorts of professions would be very much around the logical approach. But the other approach is the emotional approach. That's where people talk about values. They talk about beliefs and perceptions and how people are feeling. And of course, lots of people are influenced that way. You may be one of those. So have a look at your scores on your influencing profile, and is your logical approach higher than your emotional approach, or the other way around? And again, the idea is, depending on the situation you're in or the people that you're trying to influence, you should be able to fluctuate between a logical or an emotional approach, depending on the circumstances and the people you're influencing. So all of that means that we default to 4 strategies: investigation, which is a push logical strategy; calculation, which is still a logical strategy, but using instead a pull style; an motivation, which is a push style using an emotional approach; and collaboration, which is a pull style using also an emotional approach. So what I'm going to do, of course, is unpack those 4 and explain to you a little bit more detail about when they should be used, who uses them, and how you might benefit from that. So if you've got any questions, folks, or any comments or observations anywhere through the broadcast, type them in the question box, bearing in mind I'm the only person that gets to see the questions, and I'll be happy to respond to them the moment I see them. So while you might be thinking about that, let's move on to unpack these 4 styles in more detail. Now, the first thing that is useful in your profile is that you will have a page in your profile. I'm not sure what page it is, but you'll notice that there is a profile page that's got a number of percentages. Now, this isn't my profile, if you're wondering, but it is certainly one of my clients who went through a coaching exercise with me. And essentially, it showed their preferences around not just the push and pull or the logical and emotional dimensions, but it also showed what their strength was in terms of the strategies. And you can see here that this person clearly has a predisposition towards investigation with 74%. So that's their preferred style. They prefer to deal with logic and fact and structure. But you'll also notice, of course, that down below on the emotional side, which is 53 versus 70, this is an area perhaps for some growth. And of course, if this person was up against somebody who liked to be influenced using motivation or collaboration, and they weren't willing to be flexible, they would probably find that they weren't quite as effective, for the simple reason that they weren't gelling with the other person's influencing capability. Now, the other thing that's about this that's important is you'll notice that there are 16 capabilities that are actually underpinning each of the 4 strategies. And you can notice that there are scores around that as well. And each of these 4 are the sort of pillars or the support, and it breaks it down even further. So at a glance, if you look at this profile, you can see, for example, that down here in the bottom right-hand corner, active listening and building trust and perhaps even sharing ownership are 3 areas that I would be recommending and have done so to my coachee. And I'd be suggesting that they try and build up those capabilities, because obviously they're lower scores than some of the higher scores around the grid. So if you look over here, for example, there's 85% on giving feedback. There's 83% on giving evidence, or gathering evidence, I should say. So you can see, and down here quite significantly, 88% on communicating openly. So these are obviously strengths for this person, but the point is, even though they're strengths, they may overuse them too much in their approach to influence, and that in itself is not always going to be effective. So the trick is to try to use all 16 capabilities in the right place at the right time with the right person. Easier said than done, but of course if plan A doesn't work, we default to a plan B or a plan C until we hit the mark. So that's a useful page for you in the profile, and it's worth just going back over that and putting circles around your relatively low scores and putting circles around your relatively high scores, as I've just done or just pointed out, and to consider ways and means that you might be able to build up your low scores and not to allow the higher scores to dominate too much in your communications with your colleagues. Okay, so that's an important plank in the profile. So what I'd like to do now is move on to each of those 4 strategies I talked about, and to consider each strategy and perhaps link one of those famous people we just referred to at the beginning of the broadcast and give you a chance to consider them in action. So the inquisitive investigator, and I use an adjective in there so it gives you a little bit more information about what investigators do. Obviously, if you had a high score here, it'll be very, very obvious to you. But investigators like to marshal their facts and figures and assertively advance their argument. And they'll use logic to persuade, and they'll usually be very methodical and structured in their approach. And Al Gore was or is such a person. So if you get a chance to watch his video, The Inconvenient Truth, on YouTube, and I have put a clip in your electronic copy of your profile, you'll see that he uses charts and graphs and statistics to make a really important and compelling point about the need to do something about climate change. So, his style is very obvious when you see The Inconvenient Truth, which is that very well populated video on YouTube. So people in occupations that use investigation are people like police. What they do is they marshal evidence, put forward, hopefully, in their mind at least, a compelling case about why somebody's guilty before a jury, and the jury will make a decision and a verdict on that person based on the evidence that's put forth in a court of law. Now, scientists and researchers usually have a hypothesis that they start with, and then they demonstrate to prove or disprove that hypothesis using a rigorous research methodology. And of course, they can gain enormous influence if their methodology is proved to be successful. They can certainly change the course of our knowledge about science based on their research. So where you would use this would be in workplace incidents around safety or harassment. Now, if there's a safety issue that occurs in your workplace, it requires somebody to do a methodical and rational investigation. And of course, based on that report, certain recommendations will be made. And because that report's done that way, it's likely to be influential. Or if somebody's been harassed in the workplace and they make an allegation of harassment, there is a requirement to investigate it. But you would investigate it using a fairly, you'd use it using a logical and systematic approach. Now, where you wouldn't use this approach would be for large-scale change, where you want to get your people on board with you. So maybe where you want to win the hearts and minds of people, it's probably not really the logic that people need to know at this point, but rather the general direction or thrust of where people are attempting to take them. So you can see that if you use the wrong strategy, you're likely to get a poorer result. Now, the other logical approach is the clear calculator. Now, calculators will be clear because they're very clear about where they stand on issues, and Margaret Thatcher is a classic case in point. So calculators will like to promote the positives of a proposal, and they highlight the weaknesses of a current proposal. So they wedge people to see that there is a better or newer way of doing things. Now, a good example of that would be the other day I walked past a computer store, Harvey Norman's, and as I walked past the store, there was a sign on the store door saying 40% off all laptops. Now, I wasn't intending on going into that store, but I thought on the strength of a 40% reduction in laptops, I would at least be curious enough to go in and have a look, which I did. But there was another sign inside the door saying, in order to get your 40% discount, you must purchase by the close of business today. So retailers use calculation very effectively to wedge people and to purchase a product or service based on the positives, and of course to talk about the fact that there's a deadline, so to speak. So Margaret Thatcher, of course, was a past, she was a very clear calculator who used to, very aggressively promote a ideology or an approach, and on the other hand, she would try very much to discredit the opposition to that approach. Hence, the fact that she divided people. People were either for her or against her. But one thing you can say for sure is they knew where they stood. So, as I mentioned, people in sales will have a tendency to use calculation in order to get people to purchase their products or services. Financial advisors will often talk about the very best deal and the fact that you need to get in on the ground floor in order to take advantage of the opportunity. Animal trainers and teachers also will use the line in the sand and talk about the fact that you step over the line, you're in strife, and if you stay this side, you're fine. So, for example, animal trainers will often use a whip and a box of treats, and they will give the animal the treats when they do their feats, say in a circus, and of course they get a whip if they're a little lazy or not moving into position quick enough. So any change in the workplace that will actually impact on the way employees do things and their methodology might require you to be selling the benefits to them personally. So how will they benefit? So for example, if you were trying to persuade a group of people to do some harassment or bullying legislation training, you might explain to them that they may be vicariously liable if they're not aware of the law. And in fact, by doing the training, it'll help them make sure that they're not put into positions where they are vulnerable. So we might argue that point. But where a direction is quite fuzzy or vague, such as opening up in a new market and people don't know the rationale for that, they're probably wanting the facts before anything. So they'll want to know, why are we moving into this market? How big is this market? How's it going to impact on me personally, and so forth and so on. So again, you can use calculation in the wrong circumstances and not get the result that you want. Now, Martin Luther King, we're going now to a stage where we're looking at the two emotional approaches. And the first one is the mindless motivator, of which mindful motivator. Martin Luther King was one of those. So his speeches were filled with beautiful rhetoric and prose, and he used to persuade people with his timing and his rhetoric and his stories and his emphasis and his accents. And so motivators will use emotion to influence. So they're usually big picture thinkers, such as entrepreneurs, and what they're attempting to do is to link a cause with a compelling vision of the future. So they're basically selling people on a big picture. In Martin Luther King's case, of course, he was trying to sell a message that we need to consider civil rights and to make sure that discrimination was abolished. And of course, he worked very hard during the 1960s to push a message around that. So motivators will often have their way with words. They can define a simple and compelling vision. So if you think about some occupations that would very much thrive on the mindful motivator, you've got people like entrepreneurs. So Richard Branson or an Elon Musk, for example, are trying to sell and paint a very compelling vision of the future. And what they do is they surround themselves with people who buy in to that particular vision and help them, of course, achieve it. So advertising executives, of course, have only a split second to convince you of buying their product or service. And so what they do is they tug at your heartstrings. That's their way of doing things, because that's all they can do in a short period of time. Public relations executives, artistic directors, and so forth. So if you're attempting to develop a new strategic direction and you're wanting to capture the hearts and minds of people, then painting a very compelling vision of the future is critically important. Now, you don't have to become a great orator like Martin Luther King in order to do that. If you're good at telling stories, and most of us are, we just probably don't consider ourselves to be good at that, but telling a story can be very, very influential in the sense that it's painting a picture of how things should be, or perhaps even a mistake that's made in the past and what people can learn from it. But again, if people are unclear about the rationale of a new initiative, so for example, if all of a sudden budgets were cut, but we didn't know why they were cut, we didn't know how deeply they would be cut, and we didn't know where they'd be cut, these would be the questions that we'd want answered before we start trying to motivate people to consider what they'll do in those circumstances. So we'll want the information about that. We want to know the facts around that and why they're occurring. So again, you can use the wrong strategy in certain circumstances, and of course you'll be less effective. Finally, the collegial collaborator is somebody who will tend to influence people by using emotion. So again, it's, emotion is the approach, but the difference here is the collegial collaborators will tend to be team builders. What they tend to do is they can build coalitions of support and teams, and so they can engage the hearts and minds of people by galvanizing the team. And Mother Teresa was one such person. There were many, many people who volunteered their life to help her achieve her vision in the streets of Calcutta and other parts of the world. And they did that because she was able to collaborate with them in such a way that they wanted to give their life to that cause. So if you've got a high score in that area, it's likely that you enjoy working in teams and you work very, very hard to build the team, to build the coalition, to make sure that people's esprit de corps is reasonably high. So who uses that? Well, conductors of orchestras don't play a musical instrument. What conductors of orchestras do is that they defer to different sections of the orchestra at different times during the piece of music that they're conducting, and they create a beautiful ensemble by being able to collaborate with the musicians at the time. And of course, funeral directors will do exactly the same thing by marshalling whole lots of different stakeholders. So you pay a funeral director to bring together lots of different interests. Nobody necessarily enjoys going to a funeral, so the funeral director has to do all the coordination and bring all the bits and pieces together in a harmonious way. So in circumstances in your team where there's diverse and strong views, then what you probably should do is get the team together and ask people to respectfully air their points of view and have a debate or a discussion about it, so it helps the team to understand the different points of view in the team. And hopefully by doing that, you create a little more harmony in the team. But on the other hand, if people want to know the logic and the rationale behind a decision, such as introducing a new customer relationship management system, they don't want to collaborate yet. They do want to know a little about the facts, who's going to train them, how am I going to operate this system, when's the transition from one to the other going to take place. So they need a more logical approach, and once they understand the facts, they're really perhaps in a position there to be able to collaborate with you about how to make that work. So that's the 4 different strategies, and so when you come back to your influencing capabilities profile, the key message for you is that you should be using all 4. Now here's a little tip for you. When you're giving a presentation, and when I say a presentation, it might just simply mean during a team meeting, or it could be at the other extreme where you've got thousands of people in an auditorium, whatever it might be, where you've got a collection of lots of people and you're trying to persuade them about a particular concept or approach, then my strong advice is to use all 4. Why? Because it's highly likely that because you've got more than one person in the room, that you've probably got people who have got different profiles in the room. So what you need to do is you need to use all 4 in your presentation. For example, you might start your presentation with the facts. So you use investigation. Here are the facts. Here are the circumstances, why there needs to be change. And then you might then talk about how it's linked to the strategic direction of the organization. So now I'm using motivation. So I'm painting a big picture of what's needed. I then might ask people questions and try and engage my audience somewhat so that they're involved in the discussion. So I'm now using collaboration. And I might finish my presentation by talking about the pros and cons. So I might talk up. My last slide might, for example, identify 3 or 4 key advantages of my proposal. And I might also talk about the disadvantages of not actually going down this way. So I'm actually looking at what, pretty much wedging people to see that this is the best way to do things. Don't assume, of course, that people can work out the pros and cons. Often you have to articulate those when you're giving a presentation. So you can see that if you used all 4, notwithstanding what it is you're trying to influence, but if you use all 4, you're likely to hit the mark with all the different types of people and their particular profiles in the room. So, but the trap that a lot of us will fall into, of course, is that we'll use our own particular strategy, and of course we'll bypass the other 3, which means that you're going to be less effective when you're presenting to a group of people. So in your team meetings and in wider audiences, it's important to use all 4 strategies and be conscious of that. So in your profile, of course, you've got some definitions that will give you some ideas around what those mean. I've already run through them with you. And as I said earlier, the key message for you is to identify your relatively low scores and think, how can I, and if you're not sure why the score is low, it's important perhaps to go back and look at the questions and think, well, why did I answer it that way? And think about what you can do to beef up, if you like, that particular capability so that it becomes natural for you to use that in future. So what I'm going to do now is spend the last 15 minutes or so just running through some key things that you might be able to do in order to improve your 4 strategies. So here's some practical suggestions that come out of my book. So if you wanted to improve your ability to investigate, what I suggest, one of the things you could use is use what we call third-party endorsement. Now, third-party endorsement is where you might defer to somebody who's highly respected in your industry, or perhaps even in another team in your organization, who might have who may have implemented a similar approach, and quote them, or even better, perhaps, is to get them to come to the meeting, because people will instantly recognize that person's credibility because they've walked the talk. Or another approach, and we do this when we're recruiting people. When we're recruiting and selecting people, we use structured interviews, don't we? So we might have a panel of 3 people. And what happens during those interviews is we ask the same questions to everybody, all the candidates, and then we score them so that we can justify our decision at the end of it and say, well, this person got the job because, they had the majority, that they responded best to those questions, which we considered to be valid questions for the job. So structured interviews can be very useful methodology. Surveys, of course, we're all surveyed out, and you've got surveys to fill out all the time, and people are expecting you to do that. The reason that surveys are so popular is, of course, that the results of the survey, which arguably is an investigation tool, can be hugely influential. Look at the opinion polls and how politicians take notice of that. Consider some of the engagement surveys you conduct in your workplace and what might occur as a result of that. So conducting a survey is definitely an investigation tool. Now, the other approach, and you can see it on your screen, is a process map. So if you're trying to improve a process in your workplace, and you don't need any particular skill to do this, you simply get a whiteboard and you map out all the steps involved in the process, as I've done on the screen here. And if you involve your team in that discussion, then you're also incorporating 2 different types of influencing strategy. You're using collaboration, because you're asking your team to be involved in the discussion, and you're also using investigation, which of course is the process mapping tool. And so it's likely to be very effective that at different points during the process, you can enter into discussion or a debate with your team and ask them what the best way forward might be to make that a better process, or how might we iron out the bugs in the system, if you like. So that would be there's there's 4 tools that you can use. Now, if you look at the calculation tools, you've got 3 there that I'll refer to. You've got a force field analysis, and Kurt Lewin was the first person to come up with the force field analysis. Essentially what he did is he drew a line down the center of the page, and what he did is on the left-hand side he'd write all the driving forces for change, and on the right-hand side he'd write down all the restraining forces for change. So what he was looking at is all the favourable circumstances and all the unfavourable circumstances or barriers on the right-hand side. And again, if you do a force field analysis with your team, and it doesn't take any great skill, you are incorporating 2 influencing strategies: calculation and collaboration. And it can be very effective. And then, of course, you look at your driving forces and think, how can we maximize those forces? And again, you look at your restraining forces and think, how can we minimize those forces to make it a more compelling argument that we need to change? Now, most organizations respond very well to a cost-benefit analysis. And all that simply means is we consider all the costs of change. On the one hand, we try and calculate those, and we also try and calculate all the benefits as well. And what we're attempting to do there is to work out whether the costs outweigh the benefits or whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And of course, if the benefits outweigh the costs, and it can be demonstrated, which is of course a logical approach, then of course it's likely to be influential. And for sure, if the costs outweigh the benefits, it's likely not to be an influential approach. Now, the military often use an after-action review, which is essentially based on 3 key questions: what went well, what didn't go well, and what can we do differently next time. So this is like a debrief, if you like. So after a project or after a task, again, you can get your team together so you can combine collaboration with calculation and actually do what we refer to as an AAR, which is an after-action review. And that can be highly effective in terms of the learnings that come out of a project or a task that's done by the team. Now, moving to motivational tools, these are now emotional approaches. There's a couple of things that I've listed here that you might find useful. One of those is a team values charter, which I designed and wrote up in detail in my book. So it's based on 4 key questions. So you get your team together, you ask them to bring a pad and pen with them, or they could write this on a spreadsheet, on a Word document if they choose. And you ask them 4 simple questions, and you actually ask them to write these questions down. You do the same thing, and you do this during the meeting. The 4 questions are: if there was one value that was important to you, what would it be and why? One value that's important to you working in this team, what would it be and why? So these are distinct from the organisational values. These are the values that govern the team's conduct. So I, for example, might write down the word respect for the first question. So question 2 would be, how would you define that value? So I might say, for example, respect to me means that my opinion is valued within this team. That's my answer. So question 3 then is, why is it important to you? I might write down, respect is important to me because I want to feel as if I have some influence in this team. And question 4 where the rubber meets the road is what behaviours would demonstrate that value. So I might say, for example, when I am sharing a point of view in my team, that I'm not interrupted and I'm listened to with some degree of respect, you see. So you get people to read out these four, or the four answers to these four questions, and what happens is that you can then formulate a team values charter, which is essentially the values by which we as a team will operate. So that works really well. You'd be surprised how well that works. Now, the second tool you might use is the GROW model, which has been around for a long time. GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and what next. So when someone comes to you and they want you to fix a problem for them, instead of you just simply giving them the answer, which of course a lot of us do to save time, it's a good idea to ask them a series of questions. So for example, I might say, what's the end game? What's the goal you're aiming to achieve here? So they need to be crystal clear about what they want in the end. Question 2 is, what's the reality? R stands for reality. What are the barriers that are getting in the way? Question 3 would be, what are your options of resolving this? And you'll notice the word is plural. So I'm actually expecting them to come up with more than one option. And by doing that, we've got an array of possibilities around how we might resolve a problem in the workplace. And question 4 is, what next? Which basically means, what do you need to do next? What's the next thing you've got to do when you leave my office, for example, or my workstation? So that empowers or enables other people to answer their own problems. Storytelling, as I mentioned earlier, is a very powerful motivational tool. So tell stories, and when I say stories, they don't have to be creative, they just have to be real life circumstances, and they're very good, particularly when you want to talk about a story that impacted on you personally and in a negative way. So if you're trying to explain to people the need to do your homework before you talk to your customers, a good story might be a time when you didn't do your homework and the consequences that came from that. People will remember stories rather than be lectured to. The other thing I'd suggest you do in your team meetings is start off with the win for the week. Go round the group and ask each person to come to the meeting with a positive that occurred during the week. Now, surely something positive happened during the week, but you might find people struggle with this because usually in meetings we're sitting there trying to sort out what the problems are. So why don't we just balance that up a bit and actually go around the table and ask people to tell us a positive that occurred during the week? And you'll find that that's very effective, and it creates an upward spiral of positivity rather than a downward spiral of negativity. So there's some tools for you for motivation. And finally, let's look at collaboration. So bearing in mind, collaboration, of course, is about bringing the team together. So you might start one of your meetings by doing what Stephen Covey talked about in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. So give people a goal. So you might say to people in the team meeting, what I want to do by the end of this meeting is work out a strategy that we can all live with to resolve X. So whatever the problem is that you're trying to deal with. And so we've got 30 minutes of conversation or discussion about this, and I want you all to work together with me to see if we can resolve this in a way that we'll all be happy with. Who wants to start? And you do very little talking and try to encourage other people in the team to own the problem so that the team starts to work together towards a solution. Right? So that's obviously one very good strategy. Another one would be to give effective feedback, and this might be done on a one-on-one basis, but when you're giving people feedback, and of course we covered this in Unit 1, if you're giving people feedback, you are collaborating or should be collaborating with them by asking them first and foremost, how did they feel they went in whatever it is that they just completed? And then, of course, you start discussing that with them and come up to a resolution about the feedback and what worked and what didn't work. And when you're listening to someone, it's really a good idea to paraphrase. In other words, say, so in other words, what you said is blah, blah, blah. So active listening is a collaborative tool because it actually means that you're going to be a more effective conversationalist. So these skills are very much collaborative tools that you can use if you're trying to influence. So that's pretty much it, folks. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to respond to them now. I've thrown a lot of information at you in a very short period of time, and that's the reason that I wanted you to do the profile before we got together. But don't worry, if you haven't completed it, you can still do that. It's part of the it's part of the fee, if you like, for the program. But I really want you now, in the next fortnight, before we meet again for Unit 3, I want you now to pretty much either complete the profile if you haven't, and if you have completed the profile, I'd like you to start practicing. I'd like you to start being more influential by doing things that you don't normally feel comfortable with. So I want you to try, for example, if you're not naturally a motivator, I'd like you to start using some of the strategies that I shared with you. Or if your collaboration score was a bit low, how can you take the team with you? How can you engage the team and help them to become a more effective team? By using all 4 strategies and as many of the 16 capabilities as you can, the more effective you're going to be as an influencer, which of course is your business, which is what a leader should be doing. So that's essentially it. So it doesn't look like we've got too many, well, we've got no other questions, so that's fine, folks. I might leave it there. As I've said before, and I'll say again, I'm more than happy for you to email me some of your war stories or some of the things that you've gone through, some of the issues that you faced. I'm happy to hear all that feedback as well. So we might conclude there, folks. I wish you a great weekend, and I look forward to working with you in 2 weeks' time, and have a fantastic weekend. And if you haven't finished the profile, you've still got a chance to do it. Thank you and goodbye.